magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld, Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the 8th and final part of my comprehensive 10th edition Eldari Codex review, in which I will cover Ynnari, the devoted of Enhanced Detachment. And for those of you who are panicking about the Crusade rules, I will cover them, just not as part of the official review. I will get to them. They're just some things that I think are a little bit more pressing that I plan to do next. Okay, Ynnari. Like elves in general, Ynnari are spectacularly different than they were before. In the way the list is constructed, and the way that they play, the rules about what you can include, the general tactical vibe, everything is different. And I've left them for last, in part because I think that this is one of the most complicated sub-factions to play effectively in like all of 40K. Just figuring out how list construction works when you're reading the rules is weirdly complicated, and then figuring out how they want to play tactically on the table is initially surprisingly not obvious. Ynnari are no longer the faction that invites you and incentivizes a player who wants to mix elves from all three Eldari factions. So you can have on the table Azuryani and Drakari and Harlequins, but you probably won't. And it's also no longer an aggressive melee trading army, which Ynnari have at times been in the past. You will do some aggressive melee trading, but that's not really the identity of the subfaction. Instead, it seems, and as we have no tournament data, this is an untested hypothesis, but it seems that the way Ynnari are designed to play is to put incredible pressure on midfield objectives, not with their killiness and not with their durability, but with their ability to make those objectives sticky or grab them in weird ways to force your opponent to commit to the midfield. And then to absolutely brutalize the opponent in the midfield with units that are very powerful, either at close range or in melee. If your opponent doesn't commit to the midfield, she totally loses the objective game. And if she does commit to the midfield, you make her feel like a wad of chewing gum in the Incarn's mouth, while you absolutely tear her apart with glass cannon elf brutality. And there are some powerful movement shenanigans that will let you rocket units into your opponent's backfield to get the stuff that she's trying to hold back for the late game. So like, you dominate the midfield objectives, you make her commit to the midfield, but if she doesn't commit with the stuff you really want to kill, you have tricks to go into the backfield and kill those things. And then it seems to be maybe a little bit about out-trading your opponent, but possibly you win the game with fewer models on the table than your opponent. Tyranids played this way at the beginning of 9th edition, where you like would basically lose your whole army, but you would win the game, which thematically makes sense, right? Ynnari they're death elves. They're all going to die. That's the big in-lore plan. And it's fun and interesting that the way this is designed is to bring about that end without just being yet another aggressive trading army. From a design perspective, I think this is very clever in the way that it dovetails with the narrative. Also, some of the mechanics remind me a little bit of the Slaanesh Legion of Excess, which is neat because of the tension with the Ynnari and what exactly is the Incarn and Slaanesh. It's cool. It's, again, hats off to the designers. This is very clever. That said, it is not easy to play, and it is not straightforward. So let's dive in. First of all, when you build a list, if you are going to run the Ynnari detachment, there are a bunch of subclauses and limitations. One, either Yvrain or the Incarn has to be your warlord, which is fine. And I think you want both of them. They're both very good. Two, you may not have any other epic heroes. No Phoenix Lords, no Avatar of Cain, no Harlequin Solitaire, no Eldred. And that is a loss you will feel hard, because the Phoenix Lords are probably the most singularly powerful set of data sheets in the new book. You don't have the option to spam command points with Eldred. And the Solitaire is just cool as an aggressive melee trading piece that probably would have been really good in a Ynnari detachment if clowns had benefited from Ynnari rules, which we'll see they don't. You can have them, but they don't. They can't use any of the subfaction abilities. Okay, so you get access to Yvrain and the Incarn and the Vizark, who cannot appear in non-Ynnari lists anymore. And in exchange for all those epic heroes that you gave up, you get access to a subset of Drukhari datasheets, which is more limited than it was in the index. And some of the most popular index includes are gone. Scourges are gone. Mandrakes are gone. There are some other things that are gone. Index Ynnari were mostly using the old Warhost ability with the crazy rerolls to buff Dark Lances. And that's obviously not a thing anymore, so we may not feel those losses as much as we might otherwise have given how they play now. But if you look at the data sheets you get relative to the data sheets you lose, initially it will look like a bad trade. But I think that it would possibly just be overpowered if it didn't work this way, and because the Phoenix Lords are crazy pants. And also, with the exception of Fugan, I think the playstyle on the Phoenix Lords doesn't really suit what Ynnari are designed to do. In any event, the Asuryani and Drukhari units that you include in your army will get the Ynnari keyword. Well, the Drukhari units don't need to get it because they have the data sheets that they have in the index already have that keyword built in. But any Asuryani units you put into your Devoted of Inia detachment will just get the Ynnari keyword tacked on. So they get access to the Stratagems and the faction ability. And you may have Harlequins, but they don't get the keyword, which is so that's going to mean you're not going to want them. Because everything in this detachment relies on the engine of the detachment ability in some way. Okay, so there are 3 detachment abilities. The first is called, these are all strength from death. They're all strength from death. The first is called Lethal Intent. This is the big one. It's insane. It's so good. It's one of the best detachment abilities in the entire game. At the end of your opponent's shooting phase, if one or more of your Ynnari units were destroyed, you select a Ynnari unit and you make a normal move. That's crazy. Obvious things that you can do with this include moving onto an objective that an opponent just shot you off of. Moving models that were in a transport too far away for an opponent to charge if the transport was destroyed. Moving models in a destroyed transport closer to an opponent so that on your turn you can charge the opponent. Moving something really fast that's a scary melee threat that can fight first. I think this could be especially good on the Incarn, which we'll look at its data sheet and talk about it. I think that it very likely wants to start by coming out of Deep Strike using rapid ingress. And then there's a way with a strat, once it's taken any damage, for it to get fights first. The Vizark can give a unit of Ynnari Incubi fights first. Banshees do it, right? So bearing down on your opponent with something that is unsafe to countercharge could be really good. Or just if your opponent doesn't have melee units in that part of the field, making a normal move with something like a unit of Shining Spears, or even just as a way of accelerating your Wraith infantry up the board, or like a Wraith Lord. I had been thinking that the Incarn, will look at its data sheet, but it still does the thing where when your opponent kills a unit, it can take the place of the dead unit. So I had been thinking if you take the place of the dead unit during the shooting phase, and then at the end of the shooting phase, you move with it, that could be pretty fearsome. But I think somebody, maybe it was over on my Discord, pointed out that there is a rule that prevents that particular double dip, where if you set a unit up, you can't then move it in the same phase, which is kind of too bad. And I a little bit wonder if maybe you're not supposed to be able to do that with the Incarn, because you really have to get extra mileage out of the stuff that you're getting, given everything that you've given up to get the Ynnari and the Drukhari units. But in any event, the capacity to use Lethal Intent for just insane movement shenanigans, either to reach your opponent's critical units very early in the game with powerful melee threats, or late in really any time in the game, or to just make it impossible for your opponent to control objectives in the midfield unless they move into the midfield, is probably going to be the single thing that makes Ynnari challenging to play against. And also because that's such a complex movement shenanigan that requires careful decision making and forward planning, because you can only do it with one unit. This is the kind of thing that in the hands of a really good player is like a tactical nuke, and in the hands of someone who's pretty new may not be all that useful. This is not situational. This is something you plan for from the beginning of the game. Oh, you can also chain this with fade back. So potentially your opponent could shoot a unit that could fade back, but actually maybe kind of fade forward, and then make a Lethal Intent move at the end of the phase, moving some crazy amount. Or you could have a unit fade back behind something the first time it gets shot, and then at the end of the phase, come back out with lethal intent, which could have all kinds of weird applications. Okay, the next faction ability is called Lethal Surge. Once per turn, when a Ynnari unit from your army performs the Fade Back Agile Maneuver, it can make a Lethal Surge move instead of a normal move. You roll a d6, you add 1, and you can finish in engagement range. Now, it does eat up Fade Back, so if you're not fading back, unless it's with Guardian Defenders, if you do this, but it's really good. So your opponent shoots the Incarn, and it moves into combat. Your opponent shoots a Wraith Lord contesting an objective. It moves to fight the thing that's trying to contest the objective that your opponent was trying not to engage. Also true of Wraith Infantry. And it could be pretty good for something like a big unit of Incubi being led by a character, which we'll talk about later. At times, the application will be somewhat limited for the simple reason that Eldar are so fragile that something like Striking Scorpions or Howling Banshees are likely to just kind of die to a shooting attack, but it will potentially prevent your opponent from wanting to use chip damage against your smaller melee units. Like maybe I don't want to shoot a bolt pistol at your unit of Howling Banshees if that's going to put it in melee with my intercessors or whatever. Okay, and then lastly, Lethal Reprisal. At the start of the fight phase, you choose a Ynnari unit that's below its starting strength, and it gets fights first. I think when I mentioned the Incarn before, I said something about a stratagem making it fight first. I'm an idiot. It's not a stratagem. It's this. If the Incarn has been dinged, you can give it fights first. Again, like the obvious picks for this, I think, again, the Incarn, the Wraith Lord, and Wraith Infantry. Banshees do it already, and other Eldar stuff is likely either alive or dead. But this is going to be really good on the Incarn. All right, let's look at the enhancements. These, none of these is like a standout have to have, but they're all so cheap that I think 2 of them are actually quite tempting. The first is called Gaze of Ennead. It only goes on a Farseer model, and it just gives the bearers Eldritch Storm Weapon Devastating Wounds. I actually really like this one. The Farseer rolls in at 85 points with this, which is not bad, and the Devastating Wounds ability has really nice synergy with the Farseer's branching Fates ability. Eldritch Storm puts out D6 attacks with Blast in a 24-inch range, hitting on 3s at strength 6, -2 damage, or a -2 AP D3 damage. Well, with Branching Fates, you can, after you've rolled, change a hit roll or a wound roll to an unmodified 6. So, and you can't do it on support weapons. You can do it on the Bright Lance. But the Bright Lance doesn't have Devastating Wounds. So this just guarantees that you'll be able to push through D3 mortals. Really nice synergy on a Guardian Command Squad that's also using the Grenade strat. If you have that command squad with the D cannon performing movement shenanigans in the midfield, because remember, Guardian squads do the fade back thing for free, this could actually be pretty good, and your Farseer would be close enough to the front to also be using Guide. You could theoretically also use this with Storm Guardians. The sticky objective power that Storm Guardians have is theoretically a way of doubling down on what Ynnari already do well, but they already have multiple other options for making objectives stick. But I like 24-inch automatic mortal wounds. I think that's pretty solid. The next one is called Storm of Whispers. You give it to a warlock. One of the enemies shot by the warlocks have to take a battle shock test. Don't take this one, even though it's 10 points. The next one is called Borrowed Vigor. It's only 10 points. It goes on an Archon, and it gives 2 additional attacks to the Archon's melee weapons. If you have 10 points left over, I think you always take this if you're running an Archon. The Archon has a pretty good melee data sheet and is probably going to run with something in your list. And then Morbid Might is the last one. It can only go on a Succubus. When the bearer makes a melee attack, you can reroll the wound roll. Succubuses, we'll look at the data sheets later, but also give sustained hits to witches that they lead. And although their melee profile is only strength 3, it is anti-infantry 3 up. The problem is it's only -1 AP and only flat 1 damage. So I think Succubuses and Witches just don't... I think they just don't get there. We'll talk about it when we look at the data sheets. Okay, stratagems. The first one is Pall of Dread. And what it does is use it in any phase when one of your Ynnari units was just destroyed within range of 1 or more objective markers that you controlled at the end of the phase. You use the stratagem and you make the objective sticky. This is absolutely essential to the Ynnari playstyle. So just think for a moment about how this can work in combination with lethal intent. You show your opponent nothing in the midfield. at the beginning of the game. Then, on your turn, using Battle Focus, you move some relatively cheap disposable unit onto a midfield objective and take control of it. Perhaps, for example, this is a 45-point Warlock on a bike who also performs a secondary while it's there for you. It's not close enough for your opponent to charge, but it's right out in the open. On your opponent's turn, the only target she has in her shooting phase is the Warlock, so she shoots it off the objective, at which point you spend a CP and you make the objective sticky. And then at the end of her shooting phase, you use the Detachment rule Lethal Intent to move another unit, perhaps an aggressive melee unit that will want to use this as a jumping off point on your turn, like some Incubi or some Striking Scorpions or some Banshees or something onto a midfield objective at the end of the shooting phase when your opponent can't shoot anymore. Now at the beginning of your turn, you control not only the objective in your own backfield, but 2 objectives in the midfield. Regular elves really struggle with objective control. Ynnari might not really. Unless your opponent can contest them in melee with pretty durable units that can out-OC you on the objective. This also has good synergy in the late game with the Incarn ability, the Inevitable Death, because your opponent kills something. So you put something on an objective that's somewhat durable that wants to take heavy weapons fire, not something crazy durable. So like could be like a Warwalker. But your opponent doesn't have a whole lot of heavy weapons left. They shoot the Warwalker off of the objective. The Incarn shows up. Somewhere else, they shoot a model off of an objective. You make it sticky, and then you move on to it, right? So you're constantly doing the thing. And you have other ways to make objectives sticky too. Storm Guardians obviously do it. Cabalite Warriors do it. They can do it even when they're in a transport. You move some Storm Guardians with their 5-up and vulnerable save being led by a Farseer with Guide and that devastating wounds psychic attack onto a midfield objective at range. You devastating wounds something, and the first time your opponent shoots your Storm Guardians, you run away with them, but that objective's sticky, right? I mean, so there's so much play here into midfield objective control against shooting. Okay, the next stratagem is called Macabre Resilience. You can use it on any Ynnari infantry or mounted unit, excluding Wraith constructs, and it becomes -1 to wound either in the shooting phase or the fight phase. So it doesn't work against Overwatch. This is good. We don't have anything above toughness 4 that you could use this on, but this is the kind of thing that gives survivability to that Guardian command squad. And again, your opponent tends to want to target things like Guardians with high rate of fire, lower strength weapons. So if your opponent is wounding on 4s and there's a 5-up invuln, or maybe they have an even better save for the cover that they're probably partially in, this definitely increases survivability. It's good in melee on stuff like Incubi, which can potentially have some pretty good damage output. But you can't really jack the durability of anything. I think it would have been fine if we could use this on Wraith Infantry. It would have. I think that would have been an acceptable tool. But I also think that they don't want like Wraith Ynnari to be tougher than Spirit Conclave Ynnari. Sometimes those are the only bumpers on a rules decision. It's like, it's not that this would be overpowered. It's just that we don't want it to be better at this one thing in this one detachment than it is in its own dedicated detachment. And I think that's legit. But especially given that Wraith constructs lost a point of toughness, I certainly don't think it would have been game breaking. Oh, this also has some pretty good synergy with a couple of the others, which we'll get to in just a moment. Emissaries of Ennead. You use it in the fight phase. After an Ynnari infantry unit has selected targets, you reroll ones to hit unless you're below starting strength, in which case you just reroll the hit roll. So if you use it on Banshees, you're just rerolling the hit roll because they hit on 2s. This is especially good, I think, for units that are being led by souped up characters like Archons or Autarchs. And it may occasionally be worth becoming -1 to wound, so more guys survive, but then you lose a couple and you do the thing. But maybe it's also not worth 2 CP to create that combo. All right. Parting the Veil. This is the only 2 CP one, and it is an automatic fight on death in the fight phase. So you can only use it on units that haven't fought yet. But if a model is being removed from play, it gets to fight before it's removed. Oftentimes, Eldari players determine the circumstances of engagement, and you've got some stuff that can fight first, and there's tricky tricks. But there is one situation in particular in which this could be really, really good. Well, 2, I think. One is your opponent bum rushes a totally healthy Incarn with something that can kill it outright. And the reason that I say a totally healthy Incarn is that If the Incarn were not totally healthy, you could have just used Lethal Reprise, the faction ability, for free to get at fights first, and then it would already have fought, so you wouldn't be able to do this. But if a healthy Incarn gets caught flat-footed by like Angron or something and just gets smacked off the board, you could be like, nah, 2 CP, I'm going to fight before I go. That would really be worth it. The other one would be a big unit of Incubi, especially if it's led by an Archon or one of the Ynnari characters or something. But I think there are going to be a lot of games where you just don't use this. It's also CP is precious in Ynnari lists, in all lists. So this one might end up being hard to afford. But situationally, it's very good. Okay, Soul Sight is a shooting buff. It's 1 CP. You use it in your shooting phase. You pick a Ynnari unit. And until the end of phase, ranged weapons get lethal hits and ignores cover. There are numerous units that this could be really good on, including a big block of Dire Avengers, led by an Autarch especially. 6 Scatter Bikes, so they would have both lethal hits and sustained hits 1. If you do that, though, you probably also need a Warwalker in your list to give the Scatter Bikes some AP. You could even use it on something like Fire Dragons. Or the one I really like, if you have 10 Cobalites using the firing deck in a tank, I think the way the rules still work for that is that it's just the shooting is the tank. I haven't been using firing decks in 10th edition because I'm not a Drakari player, and I haven't been running Harlequins, but I'm pretty sure that if you have 10 Cobalites in a Raider, the Raider has a Dark Lance. The Cobalites will have a Dark Lance and a Shredder and a bunch of other special weapons too. And sustained hits and ignore cover is not bad. I'm sorry, lethal hits and ignore cover is not bad. Or even on that Guardian Command Squad that wants to make use of Guide and the souped up Farseer power to get both +1 to hit with their platform and also their platforms if they take a D-cannon, and also get the lethals and so on. Not bad, not bad. Okay, this last one is called Death Answers Death. It happens at the end of my opponent's shooting phase, 1 Ynnari unit, no Wraith constructs. If it lost 1 or more models during the shooting phase, can shoot as if it were my shooting phase. Theoretically, this is fantastic. It could massively increase the fire output of a big unit of Avengers or a big unit of Dark Reapers or 6 bikes with Sharkin cannons. And this is another one of those places where you might think about using 1 CP to make them -1 to wound. Some more of them survive to do the thing. Now, because it's the end of the shooting phase, your opponent potentially gets to shoot them any number of times. And so savvy opponents will avoid setting themselves up for reprisal. It could be that one of the biggest values to having this is simply the threat of using it. Your opponent might sometimes not shoot a unit that they could otherwise shoot if they know that they're not going to be able to wipe out most of the models. It also just creates an additional mental load on your opponent to have to think about, like, I have to make sure I eliminate that unit by the end of the shooting phase or almost eliminate it to make sure that I'm not being shot back by it. Because what I would really love to be able to do with this is to use it with lethal intent and fade back. So you've got your you have your Guardian Command Squad with the D Cannon and the Bright Lance and the souped up Eldritch Storm and the 10 Guardians with their catapults, and they get shot and they just fade back for free because they do that. Maybe you even make them -1 to wound. And then at the end of your opponent's shooting phase, you use lethal intent to walk through the ruin, and then you use this stratagem to shoot with them. That would be so good. And I don't think you can do it. And here's why I don't think you can do it. Because both lethal intent and Death Answers Death simply say the end of your opponent's shooting phase. And so I think because it's your opponent's turn, your opponent would get to decide what order they happen in when they seem to be triggering at the same time. Or maybe not because it's a stratagem. It currently looks to me like you can't do that. But it also seems like the kind of tool that Ynnari need to really get them there. So, and I think it would sort of make sense in terms of their play style. And so, I don't know. Hopefully this will be addressed in errata or whatever, and it'll turn out that we can do the thing. But I think rules as written currently you can't. So those are the tools. We'll look at the data sheets in just a moment. this is very different from the other detachments in that it doesn't have a lot of like, you can't have Azermans, you don't have Dire Avengers fading back, you don't have Harlequins jumping in and out of transports, you don't have bikes coming on and off the board, you don't have Skyborn Sanctuaries, you don't have units just jumping in and out of transports, not only with fade back but also with a stratagem. Your elves are much more exposed in one sense, but on the other hand, you don't have to expose your elves to hold primaries, which forces your opponent to commit to the midfield and not to rely on shooting to keep you from scoring, which then means you have to be able to win in close quarters. Otherwise, you lose. Oh, before we dive into the data sheets that we haven't talked about at all yet, I just want to mention one of the advantages to having autarchs leading units. Normally, I'd said in my other videos that oftentimes we're going to prefer the Phoenix Lords for the points, but autarchs let the unit that they're leading use a stratagem for 1 CP less. So in addition to the ability to throw a grenade for free, the ability to make your entire unit -1 to wound for free, or the ability to make the entire unit shoot as if it were your shooting phase, or to give them both ignores cover and lethal hits for free could really be worth it. Okay, let's dive into data sheets. I'm going to start with the Ynnari characters, and then I will do Corsairs quickly because they are Azuriani, so they can be Ynnari too. And then I'll talk about the Drakari options. All right, let's do the biggies first. So we should start with Cat Lady out of respect. This is her cult after all. Yvraine is kind of similar to how she was in the Index, but she can no longer lead Harlequins, which was the way to use her before. She's a cool 100 points, and she can join Guardian Defenders, Storm Guardians, Ynnari Incubi, Void Scarred, Void Reavers, or Kabalites, or Witches, right? So like all of the things. I at least feel like the most tempting picks here are either Incubi, they're 150 points for 10, or Storm Guardians, who are 100 points for 10. But they both have a 5-up invuln save and some extra wounds, which helps her make use of her bodyguard ability. I'm sorry, her Word of the Phoenix ability. She still has Word of the Phoenix. While this model is leading a unit in your command phase, roll a d6 on a 2-up. D3+1 bodyguard models, excluding support weapons, are returned to the unit with full wounds remaining. So if she's showing and she gets shot and you use fade back, you disappear behind a piece of terrain, and then you resurrect some of the models that died when her unit took some enemy fire. And it's worth pointing out that resurrect ability, although it can't be used on a support weapon, can be used on a grav platform or on the Guardian defensive shield generator thingy, or it can be used on the squad leader in an Incubi model, and all of those have 2 wounds. So if you're running Incubi, there really might be an argument for starting with, if it's a flat 1 damage weapon, taking the wounds on the squad leader and then disappearing behind something, and then the first model you bring back is the squad leader. It's a little bit more complicated with the Storm Guardians because they lose their 5-up invuln when the platform thing is destroyed. But when you know they're not going to take any more fire, you take the damage on the platform, and then that's the first model you bring back when you're putting models back on the table. So that's a fun little trick. It's sad there's no feel, no pain here, so they're not quite as durable as they were once upon a time, but still not bad given that you have access to fade back. Her other ability is called Herald of Ennead. At the start of the fight phase, select 1 enemy within engagement range, and until the end of phase, every Eldari model that makes an attack can reroll the wound roll. And this is the reason that a lot of people are currently favoring the Incubi, because they actually have good melee weapons, unlike melee Guardians, only 2 of which have decent melee weapons, and they're really only just okay. The Vizarch can also run with Yvraine. They can be in the same squad like before. If you do that, you will end up with a very expensive but very powerful melee brick that I think is probably too fragile for its points, but maybe. We'll talk about it when we talk about the Vizarch. She has the standard elf character stat line. She moves 8. She's T3. She's got a 4-up invuln save, 4 wounds, 6+ leadership, 1 OC. And then her ranged weapon, the Storm of Whispers, is not much like it was. It has a 12-inch range, D6+3 attacks, hitting on 2s. It's only strength 2, but it has anti-infantry 2. So she it's incredibly good into infantry. -2 AP, 1 damage. The AP isn't all that important because it has devastating wounds. So it will just do, because it does criticals on infantry on a 2-up, it will just go straight through armor. You'll basically get D6 plus 3 attacks and then roll a bunch of dice, and everything that's a 2 or better is just essentially a mortal wound. That's pretty good. If she were leading a Storm Guardian squad who also have the grenade keyword, you could lead into a unit of heavy infantry like Terminators or something with like roughly 8 mortal wounds before you do anything else. Just shooting before the Guardians have shot their fusion guns or anything. That's good. Oh, you'd be rolling dice twice, of course, because you'd need 2s to hit and then 2s to wound. Still really good against special characters with the infantry keyword. And then her melee weapon is this spooky sword. One of the crone swords, the Sword of Sorrows. She has 5 attacks hitting on 2s, strength 4, -3 AP flat, 2 with devastating wounds. I will admit to thinking that because it is one of the crone swords, it would have been okay for that to have like anti-infantry 3-up or something. Because it seems a little bit weird that it's one of the crone swords and like the Eldari can just make Starglaives, which are about equal to that. So, but okay, it's still, in combination with the other stuff in the unit, it's good. And she's only 100 points after all. She's a unit that wants to either be a melee counterpuncher in the midfield that can fade back after she kills something and resurrect models, and then be kind of a difficult unit to get rid of in the late game when your opponent can't kill it all in one go, and so the resurrection ability is really a problem. Or you could attach her to a unit of Guardian Defenders that fades back for free and just have her essentially shoot and scoot with the whole unit using her crazy anti-infantry firepower also in the midfield behind some piece of terrain, resurrecting models every time. But I'm a little bit more skeptical about that one just because of the lack of an invuln on the Guardians, but it could work. Also, they don't really want to be in melee, but she's got a sword. She's got a crone sword, even though it's like a pretty good crone sword. Okay, the Incarn. The Incarn is definitely more of a surgical instrument than it was before because it doesn't have incoming damage anymore, but it's down to 250 points. It is a tactical piece. So it's got the stat line. It's got the 10-inch move, toughness 10, saves on 2s, and then with 4-up invuln, 12 wounds, OC 3, leadership 6. And it still has the inevitable death ability once in each of your opponent's turns if this model is on the battlefield. When a friendly Eldari unit is destroyed, just after removing the last model from the unit, you can remove this model from the battlefield and set it up. And when it kills stuff, it gets D3 wounds back, which I guess is good. It is going to take tricks to make the Ynnari, the Incarn effective. The Incarn effect. Because heavy weapons generally are going to wound it on a 3-up now. And frankly, an opponent can almost kill this thing simply with the grenade stratagem and vehicle shock. Just throw a grenade at it, drive a vehicle into it, and then it doesn't have a whole lot left. So you need tricks. It does still hit really hard. Its ranged attack is still Swirling Soul Energy. It's a D6 plus 3 psychic torrent weapon that ignores cover at strength 7, -1 AP, and then this part's nice, D3 damage. Strength 7 is kind of a sweet spot for a not a heavy weapon because stuff that's T12 still gets wounded on a 5-up, but it still wounds stuff like Terminators and Orcs on 3s. And D3 damage gives it a little bit of versatility. But where it really shines is its melee profile. Its Spooky Vortex Death God sword has a strike profile and a sweep profile. The strike is 5 attacks, hitting on 2s, strength 12, -4 D6 plus 1. That's really good into anything that doesn't have an invuln, especially if it's T11 or less. Against something that's T12 with a 3-up save, it will on average do 2d6 plus 2 damage, which is not bad. It's a shame you can no longer cheat it with Fate Dice. The sweep attack is amazing into light infantry. 10 attacks, hitting on 2s, strength 6, -4 AP, 1 damage. So that would like mop up Space Elves. But even into something like Space Marines, it's going to struggle a little bit. You're going to hit like 8 times wound maybe 6 times ish, and it does go straight through their armor, but because it does one wound, that you're killing like two or three Space Marines. So you really want to be using it on hard targets that don't have an invulnerable save, and then setting it up so it's difficult for your opponent to respond to. And the ability to take the place of some other thing that's already died, pretty good. The fact that once it's taken any damage at all, you can just give it fights first is really good. And the fact that if you need to, you can make it automatically fight on death for 2 CP is really good. But to really get the most out of this, I think that you're going to need to be making use of lethal intent or lethal surge. So it gets into some slightly more thinly held part of your opponent's line where your opponent just doesn't have the tools for dealing with it, and they try to shoot it, it jumps into melee with something nearby. They try to melee it, it fights first, and so on. I think maybe with everything is meta and matchup dependent, of course, but I think what the Incarn probably wants to be is a late game closer. So you force your opponent to commit to the midfield in the early game with your sticky objective nonsense. And then once your opponent has had to move a lot of stuff out of their own backfield, you either bring the Incarn out using rapid ingress on your opponent's turn so it can wreak havoc on your own, or you jump into your opponent's backfield with something like a unit of warp spiders that hose your opponent's backfield objective holders, and if your opponent kills the warp spiders, suddenly the warp spiders are the Incarn. Or you just chain movement. You use battle focus to make a pretty long move behind terrain. At the end of your opponent's shooting phase, you make a lethal intent move so that on your turn you can go another 10 and then still be able to shoot and charge. And over the course of a couple of turns, that's like 30 something inches if you use battle focus, potentially pretty close to 40. But I think this is the thing that cleans out your opponent's backfield once everything's in the midfield to try to keep you from just winning the game on board presence. The Incarn is neither durable nor hard hitting enough to be the atom bomb it once was that you could just drop into your opponent's backfield and make havoc. But 250 points is pretty affordable. It's about the same cost as 10 Incubi and a Radar, or 5 Fire Dragons and a Falcon, even though we don't do that anymore. It just, I think, is going to require a lot of restraint to use it effectively. Okay, the Vizark. Casey Jones from the Ninja Turtles. He's 90 points. He's spooky. He never talks. He's got his mask. He's an ass kicker in melee, but he doesn't do other stuff. He leads one of those units that Ynnari characters can lead. I've listed them many times. Any of the Corsairs, any of the basic Guardians, or really any of the Drakari infantry. And he can join the same squad as Yvrain. He's got that rule that sometimes special characters who really like other characters have. The only thing he does for the model is he gives the whole unit fights first. And then if he's leading a unit with another character model in it, which I think is only Yvrain, right? She gets a 4-up Feel No Pain, which is nice. But if all the other models in the unit die, they're not in the same unit anymore, so it only works against precision attacks. The Vizark has the standard stat line, but he's got an extra wound, and his armor is good. So he's got a 2-up save and a 4-up invuln. He's got like Phoenix Lord armor. And then his melee weapon has 3 different profiles. He does not shoot. He melees. And they're all good. The first one is the Quicksilver Stance. So it's the same sword, but it's like the stance he's using. The Quicksilver Stance is the anti-light infantry one. It's 8 attacks with sustained hits, 2 hitting on 2s. Ooh. Strength 4, -1 damage. So it's a shuriken catapult. It's a lot of shuriken catapult shots. On average, it's going to be like, let's see, it's going to be like 9 of those things, around 9 hits, right? That's strength 4 -1/1. And then he has the Duelist's Stance, which only has 6 attacks at strength 5, -2 flat 2, but devastating wounds and precision. Ooh. That is the anti-Space Marines one. That is also decent into vehicles, light vehicles, because anything up to T10 it will wound on a 5, but then it also has devastating wounds, or monsters. And then he's got his mythic stance, which is anti-epic hero, which is just a very narrative and sort of bizarre thing. 4 attacks, hitting on 2s, only strength 3. So you're really only using this into epic heroes, but minus 4 AP, flat 3 damage. This one could actually occasionally come up. It is good against an epic hero. It will hit them on 2s and wound them on 2s, and flat 3 damage, it'll just be on whatever their invuln is, because all the epic heroes have invulns. But especially in combination with Ynnari, right, who's going to, epic heroes that are infantry, most of them are, there are some monsters, is going to do a bunch of dev wounds, and then he's going to do the thing, and they're good character killers as a team, but an expensive team. I do like the fights first on the Vizark. I think it takes that 250 point big squad of Incubi that Ynnari can run around with to 340 points, which is quite a lot. But if you do have it hanging out in the midfield and an enemy infantry unit tries to charge through a wall at you, the ability to fight first makes it pretty hard to counter this unit with an infantry threat, because the Vizark and Ynnari and 10 Incubi are no joke in melee. And if your opponent is able to go wide with something like a bike unit and get a beat on them, she can resurrect bodyguards. It's not bad. I think you could also fly the Vizark around in a Venom with like 5 Incubi, which is also not a terrible combination, except that the mobility created by the Venom is such that then you don't really need fights first as much, because you're probably charging. Lots of people are not persuaded by the Vizark. I think that for 90 points, he's good enough that if you just really want to have the whole triumvirate, I think you can have him, and it's not like a stupid use of points, even if he's not quite as exciting and efficient as maybe we would like. I wish he could scout if he joined Void Reavers. That would be nice, because then you could have a fights first, pretty good melee unit in the midfield before the game starts. Any horsey, let's talk about Void Reavers. They're 60 points for 5 or 120 for 10, and they're pointed out to strip objectives. They're an objective control unit with pretty good melee. They move 7 at T3. They've got 4 up save, 1 wound, leadership 7+, but 2 OC because battle line. They reroll 1s to hit. If the target is on an objective marker, they reroll the whole hit roll, which is good. Every model gets a pistol and a power sword, and the power sword is an actually good melee weapon at 2 attacks, hitting on 3 is strength 4, -2, flat 1. The leader can trade the shuriken pistol out for a neurodisruptor and should. You can give one of them, instead of the melee loadout, a blaster or a shredder. Blasters are assault, shooty weapons that are pretty good anti-hard target, like anti-tank. They've got an 18-inch range, hitting on 3s, -4 AP, D6 +1 damage. So they have better range than a fusion gun, but don't have Melta. And then the shredder is a flamer. I think you always take the blaster. And then if there are 10 models in the unit, you can also give them like a shuriken cannon or a wraith cannon, which is fun. Ynnari are the only detachment in which I might even really consider running Void Reavers, because they're cheap, disposable, they hit hard enough to clear a already weakened enemy off of an objective, and then when your opponent kills this like 60-point piddly unit, that means something in your army triggers the lethal surge thing. And when they die, you can spend a CP to make objectives sticky and all that fun stuff. One of the biggest problems that they face is that striking scorpions are not that much more expensive at 75 and basically do the same thing better because they infiltrate and then scout, which is just a great combo. They have better armor. They're better in melee. They have less OC. But as a Ynnari player, I think you're generally relying on killing the stuff on the objective, not out OCing it. So it might be a little bit hard to justify fitting these things into a list. Also, there's kind of a weird tension between being a unit that scouts, that gets out there first, but also really not being durable at all and not fighting first, so wanting to counterpunch something. They really aren't a bad little unit. They just don't have enough synergy with stuff in the book, is really what it comes down to. Voidscarred are the souped up elite version. They are 80 points instead of 60 points, and then 160 if you take 10. They also scout 7, but they only have 1 OC. And I'm just going to say these are a completely narrative include. The squad is enormously complicated in the way that it's built out, where it can have up to one Shade Runner and up to one Soul Weaver and up to one Wayseeker, and they can be tripped out with different weapons, and each of those models has a slightly different loadout, and you've got to keep track of all these different weapon profiles. And the one has Channeler Stones, and the first time you take damage you can reduce it to 0, and there's like an ignores cover ability, and one dude's got a 4-up invuln save, and models can get lethal hits. It's not. In no way is this better than any number of other infantry options that you can have around the same number of points. It is way more complicated. It slows the game down. It takes up a lot of headspace. These are some of the most beautiful, like regular non-character Eldari models ever sculpted. They're really fun in Kill Team. They're cheap enough and functional enough that you could put 5 of them in a list and it would be fine. But I think I'm done talking about them. Okay, let's look at the Drukhari. I'm actually going to start with the Cobbleites and the Incubi, and then I'll talk about characters and other stuff, because characters are going to lead these units. The Cobblite warriors are kind of a mashup. I'm going to assume you're not a first and foremost a Drukhari player. Many of the people listening to this are probably mostly Asuryani players. So Cobblite warriors are basically a cross between Storm Guardians and Guardian Defenders. They are a little better at shooting than Guardian Defenders, and they don't have the same movement shenanigans, and they're slightly less durable with 2 fewer wounds in the squad. But they make objectives sticky like Storm Guardians, and they are 110 points to the Guardians 100. It's 9 spooky sex, drugs, and rock and roll elves being led by a Sybarite who does not have a different profile but has a slightly different weapon loadout. All 10 models come default with a splinter rifle and a close combat weapon. The splinter rifle is the standard Drukhari equivalent of a shuriken catapult, and it's quite similar. It has 2 attacks, hitting on 3s, only strength 2, but anti-infantry 3 with assault, no AP, 1 damage. Generally, the Drukhari thing is that they're a little bit worse than Eldari, but then they can stack all these overlapping buffs that make them a little bit better in terms of damage output. But we don't have those overlapping buffs here. But in a 10 elf squad, 4 of the elves can swap their piddly splinter rifle out for something much better. One can get a dark lance, which is just a bright lance, with the heavy keyword that natively hits on 4s instead of 3s. One can get a shredder, which is a flamer. One can get a blaster, which is a fusion gun with an 18-inch range but no melta. We already talked about that. And one can get a splinter cannon, which is its own thing. It's 3 attacks, hitting on 4s, strength 3 but anti-infantry 3, but also sustained hits 1, minus 1 AP, flat 2 damage. So it's a little bit like a shuriken cannon. And then the Sybarite can get a crappy version of a fusion pistol called a blast pistol. That's basically a fusion pistol without melta, but also gets a better melee weapon, because the standard close combat weapon that the Cobbleites have is just 2 attacks at strength 3 with nothing. The Sybarite gets 3 attacks at strength 3 but anti-infantry 3 with minus 1 AP, 1 damage. And their special ability is that if they make objectives sticky even if they're in a transport. I like 5 of these in a Venom. I'm sorry, I like 10 of these things in a Raider. You can't take these in 5s anymore, and they won't fit in Venoms. I don't know what's wrong with me. Because the Raider is also open top, and they can make an objective sticky, and when then the Raider takes fire, they can fire and fade off of it. And also, I think, as I already mentioned, I think the whole unit using the firing deck on the Raider can make use of the stratagem that lets them ignore cover and gives them lethal hits. But yet another way to make objectives sticky without spending CP, I think this really leans into the Ynnari playstyle, which is controlling objectives in the midfield without actually having models on those objectives, or moving models onto those objectives after the opponent's already killed them in the shooting phase. Let's just take a quick look at the Raider. I think it makes sense to do that. It has a 14-inch move. It's toughness 8 with a 4-up save and a 6-up invuln, 10 wounds, 2 OC, and it's only 80 points. It can have up to 11 models in it, so you could have a character lead a squad of Cobbleites and still do the thing. Or you could put an Archon and a bunch of Incubi in here, which we'll also talk about. The Raider can either have a Dark Lance or a Disintegrator Cannon. I like the Dark Lance. On this profile, it is just a Bright Lance. And then the Disintegrator Cannon is kind of like a Shuriken Cannon. It's 36-inch range, though. 3 attacks, strength 5, -2, flat 2. And when it makes an advance move, it automatically goes 6. So if you advance with this, it goes 20. And you could, of course, use Star Engines to go quite far with this indeed. Oh, no, I'm sorry. You could use Swift as the Wind, because Star Engines, you wouldn't want to do that, to add another 3 inches, or 2 inches, because it's not Warhost. It's 22 inches. It's a fair amount of toughness and wounds with an okay save for 80 points. Okay, let's look at Incubi. This is a lot of people's favorite Drukhari include for a Ynnari list. Incubi are the elite heavy infantry. They're kind of, in some weird sense, a souped-up Drukhari version of both Howling Banshees and Striking Scorpions rolled into a single unit, kind of, but not really doing what either one do. They, well, I'll just read you. So they've got a 7-inch move. They're T3. They save on a 3-up with a 5-up invuln. So they've got like the Aspect Warrior save. There's either 5 elves in the unit or 10 elves in the unit. If you have 5, it's 75, which is a good deal. And the like an Exarch, the sergeant has an extra wound. They've got 1 OC, and they have no shooting at all, but a really good melee profile. So the 4 Incubi that are not the sergeant each have a Clave, which has 3 attacks, hitting on 3 is strength 4, but -2 AP, flat 2 damage. And then the sergeant has 2 different profiles to choose from, either 3 attacks with the same profile as the regular Incubi, so you'd roll all the dice together, it would be the same thing, or it's got this, like, if you play into something that's hordier, you can have 6 attacks, only -1 AP, flat 1 damage, also with 4 strength, but twin linked. And they have the Tormentor's ability, stuff in combat with MS to take a battle shock test. And really what Incubi do for you is they're a relatively affordable 75-point bodyguard unit for another good melee character, or a good melee 10 elf bodyguard unit with a 3-up and a 5-up that wants to run around with Yvraine and get resurrected. You might find yourself occasionally making the -1 to wound with a stratagem. You might find yourself surging forward with lethal surge to jump into melee with something. But I think the real value to this unit is it's just quite efficiently pointed. They're the same cost as Striking Scorpions, which are, along with Dire Avengers, our cheapest Aspect Warriors. And a unit of these things with the Visarch that fights first doesn't suck, even though the Visarch, I think, probably doesn't, certainly not an auto include. Okay, let's look at the Archon. The Archon's good. I think you definitely want 1 Archon, partially because you can give it that 10-point enhancement that gives it 2 additional attacks, and you probably should. The Autarch is the Archon, the Drukhari Archon is the equivalent, essentially, of an Autarch, and it is similarly pointed at 75 points, so it's 85 if you give it the thing. And it has a similar ability. It lets a unit that it leads use a CP for 1 point less, right? So usually, usually that's going to be 1. And then in addition, it has the Overlord ability. Each time a model in a unit that this model is leading makes an attack, you can reroll a wound roll of 1, and if it's below starting strength, you can reroll the wound roll instead. Ooh, another good reason to run it around with Incubi, who, even if they're just rerolling 1s to wound, if you've not turned the thing on, are extra good. The Ynnari Archon has the standard elf stat line, but the invulnerable save is interesting. Instead of a 4-up invulnerable save, it has a 2-up invulnerable save, the Shadow Field. This has been in the game for a long time, but the first time he fails a save, he loses it. So you've got to slow roll all his saves. It's just kind of narratively neat. Sometimes your Ynnari Archon, or it doesn't matter if it's Ynnari, sometimes your Archon will tank 10 hits in a row while you cackle and your opponent curses, and sometimes the first time he gets hit, he just dies. Not usually, because usually your opponent wants to target him with volume of fire first, but sometimes you just lose that invuln right away, and then he just does a 4-up save. He can have a blast pistol or a splinter pistol. You give him the blast pistol, which we already talked about, and then his melee weapon is called the Husk Blades. They have 5 attacks hitting on 2s. They're only strength 3, but they have anti-infantry 3 up, minus 2 AP, flat 2 damage. So if you spend 10 points on your Archon, it goes to 7 attacks. Oh, and you can't roll on the Shadow Field. You can't do rerolls on the invuln saves. No command rerolls. Don't get cute. So an Archon leading 5 Incubi is about 150 points. If you give it the extra attacks, it's 160. And then you can stick it, the whole thing, in a Venom, which if you're going to take them, I think you do. The Venom is 70 points to the Raiders 80, but it also has a firing deck, but it has a transport capacity of 6 instead of 11, and it's kind of like a Viper, right? It has the Viper chassis, but it has a 6-up invulnerable save. It has a splinter cannon, which is like a shuriken cannon, but with anti-infantry 3 and lower strength. And it has a twin splinter rifle, which is like a twin-linked shuriken catapult equivalent, more or less, and a crappy melee attack. And then units it has the Harlequin thing where units that are near it at the end of the fight phase but not engaged can jump back inside of it. You could theoretically move a Venom full of Incubi onto a midfield objective, force your opponent to shoot you off of that objective, use Pall of Dread to make the objective sticky, and then use Lethal Intent to move at the end of your shooting phase, or your opponent's shooting phase, towards your opponent with the unit. If you're worried about being charged, it would be cool to have the Viz Arc in there. If not, you just have this like melee threat bearing down on your opponent. Or they could fall out of the transport behind a piece of terrain to like counterpunch stuff if your opponent tries to move onto it. And if any of them die in the explosion, they get rerolls to wound from the Archon's ability. There's some cool synergies here. All right, I'll quickly talk about Ynnari Witches and the Succubus, and I'm going to make it quick because they're just not, they don't get there. Witches clearly want to be melee tar pit units that do some good chip damage to infantry, but they don't do the thing. So they come in squads of 10. They're 90 points, which is cheaper than Guardians. They have the standard elf stat line, but then as Drakari, they have only a 6-up save, but they have a 6-up invuln save. But if they're in melee, they have a 4-up invuln save. Ooh, that's where that like melee tar pit thing is supposed to come from. And then they have the no escape ability. Each time an enemy unit that's not a monster or a vehicle with an engagement range tries to fall back, they have to make a desperate escape test. And if they're battle shocked, they subtract 1. But that's just not going to come up a lot. All of the witches have a splinter pistol, which is basically just a shuriken pistol, and then Hekatari blades. These give them 3 attacks, hitting on 3s, strength 3, sad, minus 1 AP, 1 damage. So the whole squad is putting out 30 attacks, hitting on 3s. They're going to hit 20 times at strength 3. So a lot of the infantry in the game, they're only going to be wounding on 5s, and then they have minus 1 AP. They do 1 damage. It is a good volume of attacks, but without access to some other way to buff that, which I think they would have if they were Drakari, it does leave a little bit to be desired. They don't really have a way with the Ynnari stuff to get buffed. You could give them emissaries of Inead and let them reroll 1s to hit, or if some of them are dead, the hit roll, but like that's not too crazy. If you had a Succubus leading them, it's a little bit better because she gives them sustained hits. So then if you're rerolling the hit roll, or even just 1s, that gets you a few more sustained. And she's only 45 points. So 10 witches led by a Succubus are still only 135, which is only 15 points more than Shining Spears with nothing leading them. But the Succubus similarly struggles a little bit. She's got the standard elf stat line plus a 4-up invuln save that also works in shooting. So she's a better witch. And then I've already mentioned she gives them sustained hits. And then if they're below starting strength, she gives them fights first also, which is nice, right? That's good. Her melee weapon, she also just has a pistol, and then her melee weapon is 6 attacks, hitting on 2s, strength 3, but anti-infantry 3, -2, 1. And then there's a stratagem or an enhancement I mentioned you could give her for 10 or 15 points that lets her reroll wound rolls. This unit can just about kill 5 Space Marines, just about, in melee. Pretty much gets it done. But dies to a stiff breeze. They have a 6-up save against shooting attacks. You should just take some Shining Spears that are 15 points less, way faster, can kill 5 Space Marines, and can also kill tanks and monsters and stuff. Witches don't get there. And then lastly, the Ynnari Reavers. It's the bike unit. It's like the Wind Rider equivalent. But they're fast. They're faster. They have a native 16-inch move. They come in squads of 3 or 6, so it's similar. They've got a 16-inch move. They're T4. They're the 4-up with a 6-up invuln, 2 wounds, OC2, which is nice. They have the eviscerating flyby ability if they make a normal move, but of course you could battle focus normal move for 18 inches. Over anything that's not a monster or a vehicle, you roll a d6 for each model in the unit, and on a 4-up, each enemy that you passed over, or the enemy unit suffers a mortal wound for each 4-up that you roll. That's good. 18 inches is far enough that you could imagine actually using that, especially because you're trying to lure your opponent into the midfield. So your opponent moves into the midfield. They could fly over the opponent's unit, do the thing. And then they've got a pretty good loadout. They have the standard shooting weapon on the bikes is just a splinter rifle, but then one of them gets to have like either a heat lance, which is like a souped up fusion gun thing, or a blaster. The heat lance is an 18-inch range, 1 attack, hitting on 3s, strength 14, which is really cool, with assault, -4 AP, d6, but melt a 3. So that's really good. You're going to, like most really tough stuff, you're going to hit it on 3s, you're going to wound it on 3s, and then you just land near it and you do d6 plus 3 to it. The blaster, same range, strength 8, -4 AP, d6 plus 1 damage. The only time the blaster is ever better is if you're targeting something that's further away, and even then it's like it does 1 more damage, but it's got way less strength. I mean, I think you obviously always take the heat lance. And then the squad leader can take a melee weapon that doesn't totally suck at 4 attacks, hitting on 3s, strength 3 -1, 1. And you can take either cluster caltrops or grav talons. The grav talons give the melee weapon on the squad leader the lance ability. The cluster caltrops let you re-roll the roll on the eviscerating flyby. I think you always take the cluster caltrops for this. These are 65 points for 3 and 120 for 6. You could take up to 2 heat lances if you had 6. I kind of like these things in 3s well enough with the heat lance and the caltrops. It's a really fast, cheap unit that can move behind terrain in the midfield on turn 1, and then when your opponent moves into the midfield to contest you, can fly over a unit, do a couple of mortal wounds, shoot something else with a heat lance, die and make an objective sticky. They're cheap enough to disposably perform secondaries. They're kind of like Vipers, right? Same number of points. I like the -1 that Vipers give when they shoot stuff, but these are a little faster than Vipers. It's just a good disposable cheap tool. And having cheap stuff that your opponent can kill, or at least a cheap thing on the first turn of the game, is good too. Okay, so that's Ynnari. One of the questions I think you're going to face when you do your list building is how much of the standard elf good stuff do you want in the list? Do you want a Wave Serpent with some Fire Dragons in it? There is a good argument for doing that. Fire Dragons remain some of the best target elimination in the game. They get all the rerolls. They don't need to make use of the Ynnari stuff. They can. I mentioned it earlier. I think you want some Fire Dragons because it's all well and good to say, well, you can make the midfield objectives sticky, but you have to be able to kill the stuff that your opponent puts on the midfield objectives and or screen your opponent off of them while doing it to make that count. Oh, that's another thing you can do with the Drukhari bikes is like zipping out to screen out opponents' vehicles so they can't move on to those objectives and deprive you. I like striking scorpions well enough in these lists. The ability to, before the game starts, screen your opponent's deep strikers out of the midfield a little bit, block some of those out, and then have this cheap disposable unit that can trigger lethal intent and perform secondaries and kill stuff that tries to move it in the midfield is not bad. I think Wraith Infantry may have a little bit more synergy with this list than it does with some of the others, because you can surge move with them and make lethal intent moves, which helps them deal with their number one problem, which is that they're slow. I think whatever you decide to do, you definitely start with Yvraine leading one of the squads that we talked about and the Incarn. After that, it's kind of up to you. I think I will always take a Farseer and some sort of Guardian Command squad using the thing, doing dev wounds and fading back and popping out. And without the Phoenix Lords, you may want to mess around with things like putting an Autarch Wayleaper and a unit of Warp Spiders and giving it a fusion gun and having it flicker jump into the opponent's backfield, because it also has the grenade stratagem to like throw a grenade at something and fusion gun it and hose it with the Warp Spider things and screen movement and die and trigger lethal intent. That also might be too expensive with the Archon in the unit. I will probably try to lean into a lot of cheap disposable units, none of which I need outside of the Incarn, which I'll use for late game cleanup, and the two command squads, one with a Yvraine and one with a Farseer, that'll sort of be midfield anchor units. And then it's all about having enough bully power, disposable bully power, to keep smacking your opponent off of the midfield objectives and controlling those, and maybe screening your opponent with quick disposable stuff, so they just can't get on. You need some cheap objective score, or secondary objective scores to like run around and do the thing while you're fighting. But I suspect most games are going to end with you having almost nothing left on the table, maybe less than your opponent, and hopefully winning on points. And I'm just going to close up by saying I don't think anybody really knows how good Ynnari are yet. A lot of content creators, me included, this one included, have said these could be really effective in the hands of a highly skilled player and will probably be hot garbage in the hands of unskilled players. But other than a couple of alarmist people who have been yelling about how either they're totally trash or there's like one person over at Goonhammer who's terrified of them, most of us are hedging a bit. And in my case, it's because I'm worried that there may be some hard counters to Ynnari, so some of it will just depend on the meta. But I really worry about armies that are very fast and like melee and can get a lot of presence, can just get a lot of physical body presence on midfield objectives. It might turn out to just kind of be a hard counter for Ynnari. I think there's certain orc builds that could be maybe kind of a problem. There might be some Tyranid builds they don't love. I worry a little bit about like Slaneshi, Legion of Excess. Like I think that there are matchups that might just turn out to be really hard. And so whether or not really excellent players can use all of the Ynnari tricks to win big tournaments with them may be highly meta dependent. And if it happens, it may then be kind of temporary, because then people shift and it changes the whole meta and whatever. But I don't know. I think nobody's sure about this one yet. But I do think they're going to be super fun to play with. And whether or not they're successful may come down to a little bit just whether or not they can be killy enough. We don't have the rerolls anymore on low volume of fire heavy weapons. None of the Drukhari stuff is using the Drukhari damage stacking. We don't have the Phoenix Lord tricks. And so being killy enough to control the midfield may be the determining factor. Okay, that's what I've got. If you have your own ideas about the Ynnari detachment, please leave those in the comments below. If you just want to say, hey, to help the algorithm, that would be great. I've had a lot of fun doing this Codex review, even though it's been a bit of a bear. And I plan to be back again relatively soon with some advice about the first 1,000 points of Eldari you may want to collect, because people keep sending me emails about like a first 1,000 points video I made months and months and months ago, back when it was in the index days. So clearly people are Googling around for that and watching that one and desperately hoping it will be still relevant, even though it clearly is out of date. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll do other stuff. If you're interested in becoming a patron and connecting to a super cool community, I will also link that in the video description. And many thanks, as always, to the Magnet Baron and also my wonderful community of Autarchs, Farseers, and Phoenix Lords, you guys are amazing. I'll see you soon over on the Discord. Bye.